Hello everybody, welcome to our first installment of our new series Sturm und Drang, which usually is translated into English by storm and stress, but I would say it's more storm and impulse. It's a new series organized by the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam, and I'm just the public face of this event, because behind this new event there is a team. And I would like to thank my dear colleagues, Petra Schulze-Göcking and Wiebke Pittlik, for the cooperation and for putting together this program. What do you have to expect for today? We have invited a few very illustrious guests from Germany, from the Netherlands, and in the first half of this program, which will last something like 90 minutes, we will have a conversation on the crises of democracy with two scholars. One of the scholars is Hedwig Richter from Germany. She teaches at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich, is a historian, and has recently written a book, Demokratie, eine deutsche Affäre, something like a historical bestseller in Germany. And then we have also Willem Schinkel. He's a sociologist and a professor at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And he has also recently published a widely read book on democracy in times of the pandemic, Pan-Democracies. I just learned that it's going to be translated into German very soon. So this was the conversation about democracy will take up the first hour of our program, and then afterwards we will welcome Emmy Kollau from the Iron Curtain Project. That is a collective of journalists who work on issues of democracy, authoritarianism, and dictatorship. And we will actually play a little game with the audience here, which will last roughly 30 minutes. So that's the program for today. I hope you are going to enjoy it. And let's just dive right into it. So let's talk about the crisis of democracy. Because everybody talks about it in a way that you could think the end of democracy is nigh. I reread Hedwig Richter's book, and actually, after a long period of doom and gloom, I felt a little bit more optimistic about the crisis of democracy. Not that I think there is no crisis, but you basically say crisis was all the time, is a historical fact that democracies are always in a state of crisis, and that this is not necessarily a negative thing. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, first I think democracies are organized to be in a crisis because it's difficult to get majorities, and because there are so many oppositional elements within a democracy, like the parliament, for example. It's a very elitist organization, very elitist institution. Still, we need it in mass democracies. And so this is one thing, that democracy is organized to have crisis, because it's somehow very weird and with such different elements. And then the second thing is crises are important for democracies, because democracies live also on critique. And so if there are no crises, if we don't say there is a crisis, then perhaps there wouldn't be enough critique to make democracies better, and to discuss it, and to think about how can we improve democracy.
So you would say a crisis is something like a learning moment where democracies can observe themselves and try to fix themselves if that's necessary.
Very often it's a learning moment, I would agree, but of course there are crises which are a real terrible challenge. Like I could have never imagined that something like Trump happens. I really think this is a major challenge for the liberal democracies. I think it's always important to make a difference between democracy and liberal democracy. So of course we have to differentiate between the different crises. But I would also say that democracies, that crises are within democracies, and they always reflect the discourses we are right within now. For example, after 1945, the crisis of democracies was, is there too much Americanization or is there too less Americanization? And very often the crisis of democracy was, or like in the 60s, it was like, there is too much parliament and there is not enough direct democracy. So this is also very interesting that the crisis of democracy reflect the ongoing debates. And a further important point about the crisis of democracy is that it. I'll leave it to that. I'll leave it to that.
Okay. So let's pick up on the idea of crises as a learning moment. Would you agree with that? Is that too positive of a reading of a crisis, or of this cluster of crises we face right now?
Well, I think it's a very good question, actually. It's also a difficult question. I'm trying to think with what Hedwig just said. I think it's a very important idea to think of democracy in terms of crisis. So to see democracy as a way to sustain a perpetual crisis, that would be very good, because the absence of a crisis would mean that there would be some kind of absolute foundation for the way we live together. And that can only really be a violent thing, I think. But I'm not so sure that, there is an actual crisis of liberal democracy. I think what we are experiencing is a larger catastrophe that is modernity, and that brings us to the brink of species extinction. I mean, not literally, but this is what we're facing. We're facing catastrophic climate change. So that is a larger sort of catastrophe going on, and I don't see that liberal democracy as such is at least internally very much challenged. So I'd like there to be more of a crisis, but I don't really see it. Even when just now we are still in the pandemic, and there were people who said, this is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. And in a way, I think that's a rather lazy way of thinking, because it's not like, oh, now something happens and now everything will sort of change without the hard work of actually working towards change, which always takes decades, if not centuries. So I'm kind of wary of the idea that, there is a crisis, so now we can, a crisis literally means a moment of decision. So if you now take the right decisions, twist some knobs, then we'll be in a good state. I'm not so sure about that. So I'm not actually sure if there's an actual crisis of liberal democracy, or if that's a front that liberal politicians like to have out there, so as to say that they can ward off something that is much worse.
So that implies that in order to have a learning moment, you need to reflect what is wrong. And the way I understand you is that you think there is much crisis talk, but not really a reckoning with the reasons why we are in a large crisis or even catastrophe.
Right, in a way, yeah. I guess, it's very telling that liberal democracies are very fond of mobilizing the idea of a crisis. Whether it's the refugee crisis, which is a completely doctored thing that then started to be called refugee crisis, so as to enable very extraordinary measures, or whether it's a climate crisis. These are ways in which a label is used in order to basically continue along the same path. So I'm kind of wary of of the use of that notion.
Mm-hmm. Hedwig, you write in your book also a little bit about how democracies develop and how they learn. and how they become different over time. And you make a point, and that's very different from what is kind of the underlying issue Willem is talking about. You talk a lot about reform. So kind of incremental, step-by-step change of systemic issues. How would you describe the relationship between crisis and reform? What is the connection? Is crisis necessary for reform? And is reform really the driving force? Or is it more like deep caesuras, revolutions? What drives the process, actually?
I think many different elements drive the process. So sometimes it's, of course, revolutions. The French Revolution is very, very important if we speak about the liberal democracies and the history of democracy in Europe or in the so-called Western world. But I think because we are so much concentrated on the history of revolutions, I think this is partly because it's so male and it's so triumphal and it has great pictures. We oversee the not so triumphistic history of reforms, where, for example, women are much more included. And I think if we think of democracy as being the system that lives off the utopia of equality, then we can see the history of democracy as the history of inclusion revolutions. This is a term, Stichweh, a German sociologist uses. And what we see during the 19th century, and then I think again after the Second World War, and of course we have to speak what happened within between, were huge inclusion revolutions. And at the beginning of the 19th century, the huge part of the population, the rural part, more than or around 59%, 95%, they were just excluded. And then in around 1900, a huge part of population was included. In many countries, we have the male suffrage. And so I think it's interesting to see the history of democracy as this history of inclusions, and their reforms play a major role. For example, reform of the education system. So in the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, people very often didn't have access to education, but around 1900, close to everybody had access to education. And so I think this is one and education, of course, is most important for the idea of equality and for the idea of participation and for democracy. So this is one example where you can see how important are reforms. But I have to say one thing about the destruction of the planet. I think this is really a major crisis. And the interesting question is, are liberal democracies not made to deal with this question? And I would absolutely disagree. I would say if there is a system that can deal with this problem, with this I think it's really the worst crisis we have, and the worst crisis we have since a long time. And then I think it's liberal democracies who can deal with this crisis.
Yeah, but you would disagree, right?
Yes, I would. Although I mean, I think there's lots of value in what Hedwig says. Also, to recognize the importance of reforms that have led to actual improvements of many people's lives. I do think, though, that when we think about liberal democracy, we're thinking about something that is a very paradoxical thing, because it grants democracy, but at the same time limits it to the political domain. So it's very normal for us to think that we are democrats and that we are therefore free, and that we then go to work and say, yes, boss. That's a very normal thing, but it's actually really weird, because that sphere of life where we spend actually most of our time is usually governed in authoritarian ways, whether it's a university in our case or a company. So it's very weird and in a way schizophrenic that liberal democracies claim to have sort of realized the best way the best way to govern, but then leave out this huge sphere of life, which we call the economy. And that's extra telling because it's the economy that has such huge effects on the state of the planet. So exactly that sphere we leave out of democracy. And so I'm not so, and this is one reason, there's many reasons, but this one reason why I'm not so convinced that liberal democracies are the best thing to to happen now in order to, sorry, in order to to stave off the detrimental effects of global warming.
To save your life.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think democracies live off limitations. One huge, as you can see, one of my focus in my research is 19th century, and one question in the 19th century in regard to democracy or Selbstregierung, how it was called in German, so that people have their own say, was how can this ever happen? How can this function? Because people, for example, if they vote for themselves, they vote no taxation. And so how can we make it work? How can we make democracy or people's power making work? And one very important thing was to limit it. And the history of democracy is not only the history of its expansion, but it's always also the history of its limitation. So, and I think parliament or representation is a major limit to a major limitation to democracy. And I think it's a good thing because then it works. Before democracies were in small city-states, or in ancient times it was in Athens and so forth. But now people tried to have democracy in mass states and to have a what they call universal suffrage, suffrage universel, in huge mass societies. And this worked because they combined the mass suffrage with parliamentarism. And so this is only one of many limitations democracies live off. And I think this limitation is also can also help to master these crises we have with the destruction of the planet, because, for example, experts have a say in this system. And we don't make direct democracy on how to save the planet, but we really can also give a huge impact to experts, which is, I think, very important in this topic.
Yeah, but those limits are obviously part of the discussion, right? What democracy should be and how it should develop over time. And in your first statement, you basically also showed how reforms push the limits and how limitations change over time, right? By, for example, expanding the voting rights. I mean, I understand Willem's statement about the economy basically as a statement that says this is a limit that should not be there. So the economy or the economic sphere should be part of a democratization process. Is that, do I understand it correctly, what you said? Yeah. So you would say basically one of the ways to tackle the problems would be to basically include the economic sphere much more in democratization processes.
Right, because I think liberal democracy as it is also a system that immunizes a lot of spheres from actual control by the people. So if democracy is in some way government by the people, then it's very weird to not expand it in that sense. And that's just one paradox. Obviously, there's also the paradox of claiming certain universal ideals, but then requiring there to be a border around Europe, so that in the course of several decades, tens of thousands of people drown in the Mediterranean in order to, safeguard those universal ideals. Those are paradoxes that show that, in my view, there's nothing really innocent about this idea of liberal democracy. It can only exist by drawing certain very violent boundaries in the world. Obviously, some of those boundaries are drawn along what Du Bois called the color line. And that was, according to him, the defining line that separated people in the 20th century globally. I think that's still the case. I think there's a very strong racial contract underlying the way we think about democracy. So there are definite ways in which what we call liberal democracy actually contributes to very violent processes in the world. And I think, you know, we can note that, and we can also note that that alternative systems also have their own forms of violence. So the point would not be to say, oh, let's compare and you know, and count bodies. You know, that's not. But the point is to do consider democracy as something that is an experimentation with the ways in which we might do coexistence with less violence. So, and if we think about it in that sense, there's no a priori need to confine ourselves to representative democracy or to parliamentary democracy or to liberal democracy as a sort of catch-all term for those things. So we can be more open in really experimenting with what democracy might be in that sense then. Mm-hmm. So this is what I think it's important to not a priori confine ourselves to the idea that democracy is or should be really liberal democracy.
Yeah, I think that I got this point, but I think in realistically democracy have to be limited, and I think it's important to speak about populism, because I think this is a very populist argument to say, no, we are not against democracy, we are for more democracy. And populists, I don't say you're a populist, no, I don't say it, but I think we have to have this in mind. They say we want more democracy and we want more direct democracy.
Aye.
And I think this is really very important to understand populists. And to destroy these complicated institutions, to be against elites, to be against all those very, very also ambivalent institutions of democracies, to make it much more easy. It sounds very easy. If you're a democracy, then people should govern. But the long history of democracy, and also when it didn't work, it shows it's much, much more complicated. If it should really work, and if it not only protects equality, but also freedom of people. So if it really protects the human dignity, you need to really balance it. You need to balance those very different ideas and institutions. And I also think that, of course, we have different function systems, or how do you call this Luhmann term, like economy and politics and so forth. And of course, they are not separated and autonomous. And I think in liberal democracies, you always have these discussions, how strong should the state interfere in economics? And very often they do. And this is good. And I think right now they should do more and raise taxes, for example. But I think it's to me, it sounds very naive to say it should be democratized. For example, science, you can't democratize science. It's just another logic. So it functions on another logic, and it really makes sense to me that there's politics and it is democratic, and then we have to speak about what does an economy within a democracy, what does it mean to have this? But it's too easy to say, hey, let's have democracy everywhere, more people, more direct democracy.
So we can have a discussion about Luhmann now and take this in an entirely different direction. That would be very interesting, because he's actually my main sociological influence.
Okay.
So, but I strongly disagree with him on a number of points, so that's why I get to a different point. But it is very interesting what you raise. I do think that there are also people within science working towards what they call knowledge democracy, and that there is a paradox in science that comes out of enlightenment as something that produces knowledge for democracy, but in a very authoritative way. I mean, there is a paradox there, and we see that paradox at work in so many instances where science is not trusted. So it's even if we think that science is important, I think it would be important to think about the ways in which a knowledge democracy might work. So in which we don't retreat to a position where we say, you know, this is the knowledge, So basta, that's it, deal with that. That simply doesn't work. So I do think that there's cause for democratization of a variety of other functional systems. And I also think that, within Luhmann's logic also, definitely the political system is not at all governed by any democratic logic per se. It's governed by power. And it's governed by the ability to take decisions. So there's nothing in that sense that would prevent us from democratizing other systems, because there's nothing specific to politics that would mean it would be democracy. And this is something that, when we talk about representative democracy, I think there's a very dangerous but also very important argument made by Carl Schmitt, who says, when you have representation, you can have 150 people, you can have 100 people, you can have one person. And that's a logic that that liberal democracy has to deal with. And it cannot really, because obviously at some point, and this is where I'm less inspired by someone like Luhmann or Schmitt, and more by the political theorist Cedric Robinson, who shows that at some point in the evolution of political theory, the idea of representation got to be a way in order to keep the people away from power. So
this was the start of representation.
Right. So
yeah.
So, but so in let's say in modern political theory in the 18th century, this became a very explicit concern. We should indeed, and as you say, we should think about the limitations. And I think that if we want to look at, again, go back to that fundamental question, how might we do coexistence with less violence than there is now? If we look at that, if we look at the models that we see, for instance, in countries that were at some point colonized by the West, if we look at indigenous peoples and their ways of organizing coexistence, there's nothing necessary about a liberal democracy, and there's certainly a hard argument to make that liberal democracy is the least violent way of doing coexistence. So I want to still try and, keep open that possibility, if only for, our imagination, to think that liberal democracy will not be the end of history. So, and quite literally, obviously, in 1,000 years from now, there will be no liberal democracy. No system has lasted that long. Likely this one won't as well. So we should think about the kinds of systems that are also possible, the kinds of ways of organizing coexistence, I think.
But I think there are two larger conceptual questions here, right? The one is, what is democratization, really? And the other one is, what is representation? And how are they actually connected? So what is the relationship between representation and democratization? Because you obviously have very different understandings, maybe because you looked at it historically, you look at it more systemically. But what is your understanding of what is democratization, if we talk about it, and what is its relationship to representation? Because Willem basically says there is no necessary link. There are other ways of thinking about democracy, right, and it's not necessarily representation. What would you say? You have done really a lot of research exactly on this development of representation as one mode of democratization.
Yeah. Of course we can learn, and of course we should think differently and think about alternatives. And I think liberal democracies are made to do this, and they are not like an orthodox theory which never changes. It always changes, and even in the last 30 years, it changed a lot. So I think to think it as oppositions, liberal democracies on the one hand, and on the other hand, alternative forms. So I think this fits very well. And nevertheless, I think that representation is very, very important. And one lesson Europe draw out of the two world wars, and Germany draw out of National Socialism, and Europe out of fascism and so forth, was how important it is to have representation, and that it really makes sense to have politicians who make politics, and that people, of course, can engage as far as they want, and to have parties and so forth. But there's a kind of distance between politics and people, and if people want to overcome it, that's fine. But that it's good for a system to have this kind of a gap. And I think one thing Europe is better than United States is that United States did not have this lesson. The United States have much more direct elements than Europe has, and I think many problems United States we see today they are in are because they didn't have this lesson that European states had.
So you basically say that representation is also one of the limitations, of
yes.
the one way of limiting the kind of unwieldy impulses of the masses, so to speak. And you basically say this is also very much a 20th century story. But what exactly is, from your perspective, then the relationship between democratization and representation? Is representation a form of democratization?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I go back to the 19th century, and what we see at the beginning of the 19th century, parliamentarism was a very elitist idea from Britain. Basically, and of course we know in Britain the number of eligible voters was very, very low even until the 20th century, and so the mother country of parliamentarism is not a mother country of democracy. It was really also in the 19th century people regarded this as something totally different. But this changed over the course of the 19th century, and around 1900 Parliament became, for progressives and for Democrats, a very important sign for democracy. And so this and I say it again, this connection between Parliament and between what they call universal suffrage, let's call it mass suffrage, was very important to realize democratization, to realize that people take part in their in politics, that they can engage in politics. This was a realistic way to do it, much more realistic so than to play direct democracy, which would have been impossible in mass democracies, in mass societies.
Would you then say this historical path and the results of this historical path are outmoded? I mean, it sounds like, for example, the way I understand you would have a problem, for example, with parties, with political parties.
Oh, no.
Because they're kind of the transmission systems.
Yeah. No, I'm actually active in a political party.
Yes.
So I'm not I mean, I do see its limitations, though. No, I think we should do a lot of things at the same time. So I do think that there is, under the current conditions, for instance, I do think that there's a real need to sort of take back the state from what are ultimately the interests of capital. So, and I think a party is one way to try and wedge your way into that system. But it's not all. But no, I don't think that historical story is in any way outdated. I mean, there's a recent book that came out about it. But I do think that there are different stories that we can tell about history, and so where Hedwig just said that liberal democracy is precisely the system that can be attentive to those alternatives. I am more tempted to agree with people who say that, liberal democracy has for centuries been the destruction of alternative ways of imagining how we could live together. And that destruction took place in the process of colonization. And we know that many of the fathers of liberal political theory were active in that colonization and had no problem with conceiving of the limitations of liberal principles to Euro-white people. And that is to say that very fundamental notions, such as the very liberal idea that you, as a person, you are an individual. You are an individual defined primarily by property. You know, this Lockean idea of a proper self as someone who has property. That is something that had to be, that was not there from the beginning, but it had to be installed. I think for me, talking about the 19th century, in the 1880s in the US, there was such a thing called the Dawes Act. You're a historian of US, so you probably know this. And what the Dawes Act did was, or it was also called the Severalty Act, what it did was to break up collective land ownership by American Indians. And it gave individuals a plot of land. And what that was a way to turn them into possessive individuals. But what it entailed was ultimately a kind of genocide, because if you have collective land, you can have a subsistence economy, but if everybody has their own plot of land, they might still have some subsistence, but when they die, the land is fractionated, as it was called. So their children each get a smaller part of land, and their children get an even smaller part of land. And so ultimately, that was a way in which a completely different way of doing coexistence was incorporated under a capitalist regime of free labor, which they had to sell because they couldn't live off the land anymore. So it's through those kinds of techniques, and they took place also in Europe, obviously, that we got to a situation where it's now very, common that we think of ourselves as these individuated beings who can then strive for equality. But, very fundamentally, I think that those conceptions themselves are productions of history, so that our accounts and our narrations of history cannot start from those concepts, should also account for the very production of those very ideas. And so this is just to say that I don't think that that the history that Hedwig is telling is in any way outdated. It's a very modern history. It exists in many places, but it's also a political story, in a way, about history. And I think that all stories we tell about history are political in some sense. I mean, here we have a historian that's defending liberal democracy. That is fine, but it shows that our accounts of history are always themselves also political. So therefore, I'm just saying, we can have an alternative story about history, and we should talk about where we end up.
Yeah, I think it's very important to speak of the destruction of liberal democracy. The destructions liberal democracy is setting into place. I think that's very, very important. And my terms are inclusion and exclusion. Mm-hmm. And inclusion very, very often went hand in hand with exclusion. And this is the time around 1900 is very typical for that. This is a huge time of democratization in European countries and in North America. And at the same time, it's the time of colonialism. And people could feel much more equal because there were the others. This othering is so important to make inclusions. And I think what we see here again is how did it actually work out, and how could it be realized? And a nation is a very interesting, the concept of nation is a very interesting example. Dieter Langewiesche, a historian, he said that nation is a very important vehicle for equality, because within nation people could feel equal. Everybody is a proud Frenchman. It doesn't matter if he's rich or not. And this is part of the history you miss. Property restrictions, for example, were abolished during the 19th century. So this is what you present is taking some very dark elements and putting it and highlight it.
What is good about getting rid of property restrictions? I mean, this whole idea of the nation.
Because it was important to be a Frenchman. It was important to be Dutch. It was important to be German. And every man was equal. And at the same time, it is terribly exclusive. Because you're only equal if you belong to the nation.
Yeah, but not even that. Obviously, this whole idea that it's very important for people to feel that they are equal is a very fine way to stave off class warfare. Right? So obviously,
But I didn't stay off.
yeah, but obviously people were not equal.
Thanks.
Also within the nation, they could be included, but were not equal. So there's more at stake there. It's not only a relation to people outside the nation. The very idea of giving people this feeling that now they are part of a nation, and not only a nation, but of a superior nation, because it was a white nation. That feeling was also a way to suppress class conflict.
No, class conflicts were very vivid around 1900.
Yes,
It's
they were.
It's just not this disciplining those beyond and making bad capitalism.
No, I'm not. So I'm not saying that there was no class conflict. I'm very aware that there was class conflict, but I am saying that the nation did function as a way to suppress class conflict. That doesn't exclude the fact that there was class conflict.
Yeah, but I think this is a very narrow view of it. That very different things went on, and to have the feeling that I have the suffrage, and I have the right to vote, and I see that I'm very poor. This also inflamed class conflicts because they felt empowered, and the system, the voting rights, parliamentarism, and so forth, empowered laborers and empowered the labor movement very strongly. So, and this is very typical for the history of democracy, to have all these different and paradox development in the same time, and they inflame each other.
I completely agree with that, yes.
Okay.
No, but when we're talking about the reasons why the idea of a nation was at all appealing to an upcoming bourgeoisie, because as you know, in 1850 in France, 80% of the people did not speak French, so the French nation had to be invented. Now, why was there an interest to invent a nation? And it could very well be that in some instances that invention of the nation actually backfired against the interests of those who wanted it. But that the question, who wanted the nation, is an important one. And it's not a question that's answered by, well, everybody recognized that it would be nice to be equal within the nation, right?
Yeah, but it is much more complicated to say there was one set of people, small set of bourgeois people who invented the nation. It was a much more complicated process. And for the labor movement, Dubois, for example, he was in Germany around 1900, and he said, it is so amazing, the labor movement, these men, they feel so German, and they really somehow identify with the nation. And this didn't mean that they abolished their revolutionary ideas. No, they felt empowered. We are part of this nation. We are equal. We are all Germans, or in Italy we are all Italians, and we have the right to vote, and we have our say, and we will do this. We will fight for our rights.
Right, but Du Bois is interesting because what he writes in Black Reconstruction about the U.S. is precisely that at some point a kind of deal was struck between white workers and capital, so that white workers would get what he called a psychological wage, what we now tend to call white privilege, which is some crumbs of capital, but mostly it's the feeling that you are superior to non-white workers. And in exchange, they would break their bonds of solidarity with black workers. So Du Bois is showing precisely how the idea of a nation, of a white nation in the US, functioned as a perfect way to suppress class struggle, because it broke the solidarity among different kinds of workers.
I think this is not. I would say this was really a racial question, more so than a class question. I think that's really important.
But Du Bois is making precisely the point that you cannot separate the two. That's the whole point of his book.
But nevertheless, it is also in the United States. It didn't suppress class struggle. It enforced racism. I would make this difference. You can also see this in the women's movement, that a huge part of the white women's movement said, okay, if black men have the right to vote, they actually couldn't execute it, but they had it. So why shouldn't we get the right to vote? And I think what we can see here is not one clear line. So nation is to suppress class struggle, but what we see is very paradox. So a nation, of course, was often used by bourgeois class, but very often it was also used from below. And we shouldn't underestimate how important it was for people to identify with their nation.
No, I agree with
to
those
feel
two
empowered.
things.
Which doesn't mean it is a good thing or so, but it shows how paradox it is.
I agree. Those paradoxes are there because there has been obviously no control over those, no actual control by a few people over those huge unit entities such as nations or whatever. So I agree with that. But that's still something different from having a political analysis of it. We are, though, excluding Mario from
No,
our
it's fine.
conversation.
I'm listening to you. That's good. But we are running out of time, which is much more a problem than me being silent. But one thing we see here, obviously, is that when we started to talk about the history of democracy, we were talking about limits and the scope of democratization. And one way to understand your discussion right now is really, is democracy always particularistic? And if so, what are the implications, right? So is there a way of thinking about democracy in a much more broader scope to be almost all-inclusive? I mean, your book is called Pan-Democracy. So there is the pun in there, right? I'm afraid we can't discuss that in much depth, but this is really interesting because it is really also about the question, what are the limits of representation? And if there are limits, what are the implications and the effects of these limits, right? And there are obviously very different ways of interpreting them. And we have seen a nice clash of very different ways of interpreting these limits. But I would like to give the audience at least a little chance to ask questions and to maybe intervene in the discussion. Yeah? Ido Rehan here in the first row.
Yes, so I would like to go back to the start of the discussion where I guess there were two understandings of crisis. On the one hand, the idea that democracy has to respond to large-scale crises, and then the question is, are these crises imagined or actually fundamental and real? Versus the idea that democracy itself is in crisis. And then the question is that a problem or actually a solution? So my question would be, do we need more democracy in order to face that more fundamental, for instance, climate crisis, or do we need less democracy?
So is the question to me? Or to both of us?
Both.
Well,
just that.
Okay. Well, it's not necessarily. I don't think we can really quantify democracy, but I do think that it would be good to think to have more democracy in the sense of even if we stay within a representative democracy. You know what ultimately what is represented in a representative democracy is it's people who have a say in representative democracy because they consider themselves part of a nation that has a longer history, that has some usually fictive point in the past that it can say, I'm coming out of this, so I have a legitimate say in speaking about this, and why not turn that around and say, we should have a representation not only of people who come out of a certain history, but also a representation of people who are yet to come. So we should think about modes of representing future generations. And it would be an interesting question for me to think about how, so staying within representative democracy, how could we devise or revise our democratic institutions so as to represent also generations to come, and not only those following out of previous generations defined by some fictive, idea. Okay, now we are a nation. So that would be one way to have more democratization. Another way would be to say, as Bouna Latour has said, that we also need representation of non-humans. So to think about that, to think about how to, if we recognize that life on Earth is a form of entanglement, that our life is intricately interwoven with the oceans, for instance, we should give the oceans a say in representative politics. So then we have to revise our institutions to accommodate that. So I'm very interested in thinking about those things, and that would be, I guess, more democratization need.
Yeah, I would think it depends. Sometimes you need more democratization. I think, for example, the answer of the crises of the 60s, 70s was to give people more a say. But I think right now what we see with the destruction of the planet, perhaps it's better to have more technocracy. It sounds very good to give animals a say. It sounds very good to give oceans a say, but how does it work? And I think it has a lot to do with to have more experts, to have more knowledge in politics. And so perhaps for this crisis, of course, we are in a representative democracy, and that's good, and there shouldn't be less democracy. But I think the answer cannot always be more democracy. I think that's too populistic and it's too simple. It sounds good, but how can we realize it? And a very important question.
You do realize that those were exactly the arguments that were levied against those who wanted a representative democracy in the first place. It sounds good, but how to do it? It's going to be chaos if we try that. That's impossible,
Yeah, but actually, it worked with representative democracy, and
yes, and I'm just saying. So those arguments are not really arguments to not try for something different, right?
No, but I think it would be very difficult to make it concrete how to represent oceans.
Yeah, but that's exactly what was said about giving universal suffrage to people.
No,
would be impossible to do that. That would be absolutely the end of civilization.
No, it was very concrete. It was very concrete. Give everybody a
now
voice.
I'm saying the arguments against it were the same.
I don't get the point.
For a long time, it was unthinkable that there would be universal suffrage, and the arguments against it were very similar to the ones you are giving now.
No, I don't really see that.
Okay.
I think it's really. I see what you. It was very thinkable. It was very thinkable that everybody got a right to vote, but it is quite difficult to make it concrete, to make it work, to give a notion a say.
I like how you lock horns, but
Yes,
there should be at least one or two more questions. But thank you. More questions? Yeah?
Thank you. So you just talked about future generations, and now I think, yes, in human rights and also the United Nations is speaking a lot about representation of future generations, but also now, and especially in the Netherlands, like with the Shell case or with Urgenda, the judge is deciding on these representation of future generations, which is very legally very interesting point, but also, and I think that's what my question is about, letting a judge decide because maybe citizens or even politicians, because mostly they're in 4-year terms, can't really think in these long-term I don't know, interests. And maybe a judge can act as the grown-up in the room, maybe deciding. I'm sorry, I'm quoting some people, it's not really my opinion, but it's an interesting point, I guess. But that is some people are saying, okay, this course of private law is quite undemocratic. What do you think about this? Do you think that a judge interfering more and more in private law, getting this role of also a horizontal relationship between citizens of human rights, and not only this representation in politics, but also amongst citizens. I don't know if I'm very clear, but maybe this role, which some people call anti-democratic, is also interesting to discuss. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it's a very good point. I think Supreme Courts is these are one of the institutions that limit democracy, or you can say rule of law is one of the institutions that limit democracy. So if a majority wants to introduce death penalty, for example, it's just not possible. It doesn't work. So I think it really makes sense to have these courts, and then we have, of course, to discuss how important are they? Are they too powerful? I think in the United States it's not a good solution how the power of the Supreme Court. But generally I would say it's one of these. Institutions to limit democracy. And to speak about the younger generation, I would say, for example, it's a great idea to have suffrage starting with 16 years. We discussed this in Germany a lot, I guess in Netherlands too. Yeah. So this is something that really makes sense. We can talk about it, and I think it would be a good thing.
Mm. Yeah. Just given in the existing liberal democracy, I think, the division of powers is actually what is constitutive of democracy. So I don't think that a judge deciding certain things is necessarily a limitation of democracy. It's part of the way the democracy is being conceived. So the judge trying to in the Urgenda case, for instance, in the Netherlands, the judge was basically saying that the government didn't fulfill its own promises and its own, principles. So that's not necessarily, that's how democracy, our liberal democracy functions, and how it sort of checks itself, I think. So that, and I would have no necessary problem with that. I do think that, it's going back to Luhmann in a bit maybe, because it is when you see that a political system is limited in the ways in which it can do something about global warming, for instance. I think it's very useful to add more systems in the mix and to have them do their thing. So in that sense, that the legal system has its say, that the system of science works in a certain way. That is, I think, within this idea that society consists of relatively autonomous systems is very good. That is, though, staying within the limits of liberal democracy, and we can question whether it would not also be possible to have a kind of sort of counter sovereignty. To have another sovereign, so what is called polycracy traditionally, where you would have a sovereign authority that could actually intervene the moment you have a company such as Shell, whose business model is quite simply the destruction of our ecology. It would be one way to think about that would be to say, no, let's not keep within the bounds of liberal democracy, but let's have a second sovereign that only has a limiting power, that is not active itself, but only intervenes where it becomes clear that there are parties that are actively pursuing the destruction of common life, and Shell is actively pursuing the destruction of common life.
So thank you. That's all the time we have. So it was a great discussion. Thank you so much. For the audience, Hedwig Richter's book, go and buy it. And Willem Schinkel's book, go and buy it. So thank you so much for the lively discussion. The program is not over yet. We have something like half an hour left. I would like to invite Emmy Kollau to take the floor. We're playing a game now with people here in the room. The floor is yours, Emmy.
Okay, before you can all go to the vrijdagmiddagborrel in good Dutch, we have a job to do. We have to overthrow democracy. We heard it's in crisis. There are some solutions. They might be difficult. But now, in the next 30 minutes, we are going to try to overthrow it. But before we do that, can you start the presentation first? Thanks. I'll first introduce myself to you. I'm Emmy Gollau. I'm a journalist. I work for my own company, Aldus Productions, and an NGO. And we make podcasts, multimedia productions, exhibitions, etc., etc. I'm basically a storyteller. And I think I became a journalist. The fact that I became a journalist has everything to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I'm really glad that the Duitsland Institute invited me. I was 11 when the wall came down, and I remember these images really clearly. My parents were talking outside with complete strangers. Everyone at the bakery, in the supermarket was talking. I was in front of the television, and I realized I was witnessing world history, but I didn't understand anything of it. And then I thought, next time I want to be present, so maybe I have to become a journalist. Then, 25 years later, I was already a journalist for some time. And then we started the Iron Curtain Project. It's a storytelling project in which we travel around mostly Eastern Europe, and we try to connect the past with the present by investigating, by talking to people, by making stories, and also by making these small pop-up museums. And in the last one, it's about democracy. It's called How to Survive a Democracy. The subtitle is, or should we say, How Will Democracy Survive Us? And in this tiny pop-up museum, we tell stories about dictatorship, but also we have this more like an arcade hall with different games. And one of the games is the populist game. We had a feeling that there was a lot of talk about populism. There was this rise of populist leaders, but it was really difficult to talk about the topic of populism. There were a lot of, we aim also to students and high school kids, and it's a really hard to define populism. Some people see it as a solution to the problems in democracy. So we thought, how can you explain what the bad sides of populism are if you don't even know what it is exactly? So we started to develop a game, and that's what we are going to play. I might need some help sometimes. Maybe you can count the votes, for example. And I need you to use your imagination, because you, we, all together will be populist, will become populist leaders. So maybe you have to even try to feel some empathy with them. So really try to feel your most populistic side. We play this around with most of the time youngsters and students. So I think it might be interesting to talk afterwards about if this kind of tools work, if they can help understand things. I'm a journalist, but I'm not a scientist, but we read a lot of books on the topic to make it as scientifically as possible. So maybe I need to tell our sources. We read a lot from Cas Mudde, Timothy Snyder, Bastiaan Rijpkema. We also looked into older books, Hannah Arendt, Menno ter Braak. And then we threw it all away and made a game. And we also use a lot of examples from reality. Maybe you recognize them. So, are you ready? Oh, this is the last one, I guess. So we have to switch to the internet. Okay. Hello, future supreme leaders. If it were up to you, of course, our country would be in better shape. What are you waiting for? This is your chance. Today you can become the new supreme leader. The more populist your actions are, the higher your score. Well, I guess you are ready. Let's get started. What would you like your future leader, future followers to call you? If you want to use a forceful pseudonym, just raise your hand. Well, I think most people prefer their own names. Okay, well, then I'll use mine, because otherwise it would be very complicated. Okay. We can make an election poster. We can do it randomly. Maybe if you see a good one, just raise your hand. Oh, I like this one. Are you okay with that? Yeah? Okay. What? You say it's too cheerful?
To female.
Oh, to female. Oh my God. Okay. But maybe future leaders can be females. Let's try. Okay, I'll ask you to raise your hands, and if you raise your hand, you choose for the choice on the right side. So, can you feel the craving for power running through your veins? Not at all. I'm not concerned with power, but with the ideal, a better country. Or are you saying yes, glorious?
Glorious.
Okay. Who is for glorious? Well, majority, I guess so. Okay. Image is, of course, everything. With the help of my image consultant, we develop the image we would like to project. So, would you say we are going to present ourselves as ourselves instead of hiding? No, I'm going to read it loud. As myself, instead of hiding my eccentric quirks, an odd hairstyle or posh accent, peculiar hobbies, I'll emphasize them. I'm recognizable thanks to my distinctive characteristics. Or do you say we are more the men or women of the people? That would be a better choice. So who is for the right choice? For the right... And who is for the eccentric quirks?
Oh, that's actually the eccentric quirks are more.
Okay. Okay. Who will your campaign be directed towards? Of course, at the entire population, because everybody deserves a better country. And the more followers I have, the faster I will reach my goal, won't I? Or would you say at the real people, the pure people, the people ignored by this crazy elite? Who is for the last one? Yeah? Okay, that's really clear. Okay. In the meantime, we succeeded in drawing a small, curious crowd in a modest hall like this one, I guess maybe like 30 people. What would we say to them? First choice, you are not getting what you deserve. Vote for me to lower taxes. Vote for me to solve unemployment. Or would you say, our country is in real trouble. Do you know why? we are betraying our culture. Vote for me and we will restore our country to its glorious past. Who is for the left? No, who is for the second choice? Okay. Okay, there are the first opinion polls. Let's see. Oh, okay. We did quite well. We've got talent, so that's nice. I think you are all scholars and scientists, probably, so you know, you have some background knowledge. But here are the tricks of the populist trait. Populists are deeply aware of discontent among the people, which might be a good thing, I guess. They tend to stoke up grievances if necessary. They address one section of the population and then refer to that group as the only real people. The rest, they are the elite. They blame this elite for everything. To them, criticism is like water off a duck's back. They dismiss it as fake news or fabrications by the elite. And then, whether on the left or the right, populists nearly always are reactionary, harking back to an ideal and glorious past. So now we have these lessons, and we can go to the elections. So we had this lesson, so this one is really easy. Who are we blaming for all the problems in our society? The elite. But populists can be leftist or rightist. So we have to check on which spectrum we belong. Maybe someone from the audience can say who we object to most strongly. Someone wants to volunteer? Do you want to choose? Be a populist, huh? Okay, bankers. Yeah? Okay, foreigners in general. No. Okay, liberalism in general. Yeah. Politicians. Okay, journalists. Oh my God. Asylum seekers. Corporations. Okay, people with a different religion. Artists. The EU. Okay, the climate. I don't know how you can oppose the climate, but some people do. Okay, you are clearly a left-wing populist. You could consider going to South America for an internship, but I'd rather stay here for a while. Do you think we need a slogan? Somebody has a good slogan for our newly...
Make the Netherlands great again.
Okay, okay. Okay. Maybe some color. Really girlish. Okay, next question. Opinion polls have established that our supporters feel uncertain about the future. What are we going to plan to do about it? We promise to solve all the people's problems, or we fan the flames of uncertainty. The more uncertain people feel about the future, the more likely they are going to vote for us. Who is for the second choice? Yeah? Okay. Then we have to write an electoral program. What shall we write? We will write a large document with all kinds of practical solutions, or we'll keep it brief. As long as we remain vague, no one can hold us to account. Second? You are really talented people. Then these stupid journalists come. They ask difficult questions. They say, we cannot solve all the people's problems. How shall we respond? We tell our staff to bury her in facts and statistics that will teach her. Or we would say that journalist is lying. What's more, the entire media is an unreliable pack of liars. And we will make sure that the people know this.
Can we do both?
No. Are we going to vote? Second, who's for the second choice? Yeah, I think it's the... Okay, the media keeps hounding us, and they make fun of us on social media. It's driving us crazy, these stupid journalists. What shall we do? We keep inventing new controversies to distract the people, or we launch an alternative medium and start exerting a profound influence on social media. There are even companies that can do it for us. What's not to like, I would say. So, what's the best strategy? The second one? Who's for the second one? Klaus, what would you say, Mario?
I would say probably the first one.
Yeah, we keep inventing new controversies. Okay. Our support base is growing. That's good. But we want to reach new groups. What would we do? We could become more extreme, and we dare to say what many people are thinking. At least we think that they are thinking that. So down with political correctness. Or just before the elections, we moderate our tones and we present suddenly a reasonable alternative to the other large parties. What would you say? Who's for the second choice? And who's for the first? That's also a lot. But we say this one. Okay, we can't wait. Oh no, there are greater populists. I think in this game there are two better choices, we thought. Become more extreme. It's what you see a lot. When all these Democrats think, oh no, this is not possible. When you think about Trump, for example, you think he can never become the new president. And he became by becoming more extreme. And the other is a famous a quote from Pim Fortuyn. He said, watch my words, I will be the next president or prime minister of the Netherlands. And he didn't moderate his tone. But I think you are all very talented. So I have this option to manipulate the election. I can't even pronounce it. So we won the elections anyway. So now we are in power, and now we have to try to overthrow democracy. As said, it's not easy to overthrow democracy. You have to do it slowly. That's a little tip. It's not easy because of all these checks and balances. So in the first level, it's a good idea to just do the things that you can do within a democracy. So don't do dictatorial stuff. Okay. We have to take the first 4 steps. We can choose from these 8 options. First one is you appoint as many of your friends as you can to high office. The second one is you gradually replace all judges who may be critical of you. Third one, you instruct your friends to acquire large media companies. Fourth, you shut down all critical newspapers at once. Fifth, after a disaster or terrorist attack, you declare a state of emergency, increasing your power. You lock up all your critics. You reward your support base by spending money on things they regard as important. Or you ban other political parties. U heeft volgens mij hele duidelijke ideeën. Zou u eens kunnen zeggen welke u... ja? Deze? Ja? Replace all judges? Okay. Yeah? Shut down them immediately?
Maybe you go down and reward your support base by spending money on things there.
Okay, let's try. Ooh. Replace judges is a bit too fast. I think you, yeah. Yeah, but did they do it from in the first phase? They waited for a while. So the people are getting a bit restless. There are demonstrations, so we have to try something better. So this one is not. Someone has an idea? Lock up all our critics? No. Yeah, on what basis could you do it? On what basis can you shut down all the newspapers in our system?
Oh, no. In other countries it's possible. Not in the Netherlands now.
Yeah, but we are in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
What would be possible in the Netherlands?
Oh.
I think when we look at the pandemic, this was developed before the pandemic, but when the pandemic came, there was this kind of state of emergency. There were these new inventions. So I'll help you a bit.
Oh, the one on the left, the state of emergency.
Yeah. Oh. Ah. Oh. Yeah, so this you can do basically within a democracy. But then we have to take the next 4 steps. We keep extending the state of emergency by 6 months. We ban political parties who are critical of us. We shut down all critical newspapers, for example, by saying that they are evading taxes or doing some other illegal stuff. We commit election fraud. We call a referendum to alter the constitution. If we win, the parliament would be sidelined. We replace as many critical judges as we can with judges that support us. We lock up all our political opponents, claiming that they are guilty of tax evasion, or we alter the constitution. What would you, sir with the glasses, would you have some advice?
Well, I guess you can do any of these options, and they have all been tried, and most of them successful. But I would start with extending the state of emergency. That is the safe thing.
Okay. Next step, someone?
Replace more judges.
Replace judges? Where are you? Yeah? With a good excuse, yeah, sort of, yeah. Last one?
Election fraud, one of the both. Either the call in a referendum or... You can lose.
Okay, it's not really democratical. Oh. Hey, we can make one more error. Okay, let's try the referendum. Yeah. Okay, we are halfway there, I guess. Okay, the final 4 steps. We start a war as a distraction. It also boosts our country's arm industry. We ban critical opposition parties. We withdraw from all international coalitions, such as the UN. We build ourselves a palace. We funnel money towards a secret bank on a tropical island, because you never know what's going to happen. We lock up all our political opponents. We commit election fraud. And we alter the constitution. So what would really, really work? The war? Start a war? Okay, let's do it. Ban critical opposition parties? I would say, yeah. Withdraw from the UN? No, not necessarily. Why would we go into that trouble? It's not good for our image anyway, so... Oh, sorry. Ah. Build a palace? No. Okay. A secret tropical island? Would be nice, but we can buy it anyway. We lock up all our political opponents? Yeah. We commit election fraud, or we alter the constitution? Yeah? Okay. Let's do this. Okay. Well, congratulations. We started our dictatorship. Well, so this is it. This is how we try to teach youngsters and students something about how populism works. And it's a bit of a joke, but it's also very serious, because we think if you really understand these strategies, it might be easier to see them. And I think you, for example, you found it really hard to choose from all these options. So most of the time we got these reactions like, oh, it felt really bad to do it, but now I will remember it forever. So I hope you liked it. Are there any questions? Or should we stop, Maria? You are
maybe just one question. What is your experience with high school students? How do they reflect on this game? Because I guess you do something like an interview afterwards to find out how they played it and what they felt and what they thought. So what is usually the takeaway of the youngsters who play this game?
Last time we played it, was it in Rotterdam at the ROC? And it was really funny because halfway there, these girls and boys started shouting, "Oh, but this is exactly like Trump is." So it takes a while before they understand, and then when they see it really clearly. And then afterwards, there are most of the time these heated debates. I like them the most when they talk about I think Casmudde said populism has this good, bad, and ugly side. And when they talk about the good and the bad things, that this feeling for what is living in society can also be a good thing. So it's also always nice when there's this discussion about what we should really fight and what we can learn from it, or in a way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, of course.
students who actually agree not just with the populist argument, but with many of the arguments people like Trump or Baudet actually are putting forward.
Yeah.
And so we agree, apparently, at least I don't think we disagreed. I didn't hear anyone protesting against that, the tendency of the game. But what to do with those who actually have a very different opinion about this?
Yeah. I think for me as a journalist, and also with the Iron Curtain project, we try not to express an opinion. So there, in the way of the text, there are some jokes, of course, but in this pop-up museum and the game, we only try to explain how it works, and we try to make it as objective as possible. So I'm not sure if we managed to do that, but I believe really in the facts, like just telling how things work and not say. That's why I also said it's good to discuss the good and the bad things, and not only like this is awful and we should get rid of it. So, but I can imagine it's really hard to teach at this moment in time, harder than it used to be. But
so it's necessary that you have after display a follow-up. Pardon? Sorry. Yeah.
yeah,
You need a follow-up.
yeah,
Because congratulations is the wrong word in the case of this
Yeah, of course,
society
yeah.
problem.
yeah. We
So
also
how
we
can
always
you
show.
turn it
Yeah.
the other way?
We always show also some short videos, short movies about in which Europeans tell their about how it was to live under dictatorship. So of course it's a balanced program. Also in the pop-up museum there's a lot of attention about how it was to live under Franco or all these dictators Europe had. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are completely out of time.
Sorry.
So don't worry about that. So thank you so much. Thank you, Emmy. Thank you again, Hedwig and Willem, for the nice conversation. Thank you for everybody here in the Packhaus de Zwijger. I also want to thank the team of the Packhaus for the technical support. I would like to thank my colleagues at the DIA. I already mentioned Petra Schulze-Göcking and Wiebke Pittlik, but I also would like to thank everybody at the DIA for their support, because an event like this can't be done without many helping hands in the wings. As I said, this is the first event in an upcoming series, Sturm und Drang. And obviously you got the sense that what we want to accomplish controversial debates about large and important societal and political topics, and we would like to continue with this kind of format. So please keep your eyeballs peeled for the next event, probably in fall. Please follow us on social media. You can also watch this event again or for the first time via YouTube. For everybody who is here, I would like to invite you for a little drink after this event to mingle and to chat a little bit. But thank you very much to everyone. Have a nice day and see you soon. Thank you.